Hi, my name is Jeff Canoyer. I'm going to be talking to everyone today about cultural competency in healthcare applications. So, what we're going to be going over today, we're going to be dividing this up into 5 quick little sections. The first section being the traditional definition of cultural competence. So then we're going to hopefully be able to explore a couple of new things, such as the use of cultural sensitivity. In addition to that, we're going to look at some specifics of cultural differences. Then we're going to go on to the cultural biases of healthcare as they are today. We're going to finish off with some proposed solutions. So, first thing we want to talk about is that traditional definition. So, cultural competence, as it was defined in 1989, was a set of congruent behaviors and policies that come together among professionals that enable those professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. Now, if you notice, I did put a little bit of an extra emphasis on the words cross-cultural because when I think this definition came out, I think it was a little bit difficult for people to really understand exactly how much this country was going to be able to develop in terms of how much culture was actually being seen. So that's why I personally think that cross-cultural might not be the best way to go about talking about these policies. Is it actually possible to develop cross-cultural policies or congruent behaviors that everyone can use? And with so many cultures represented in the United States, what would these policies actually look like? So, one culture's positive might be another culture's negative. Looking at this picture, I don't believe that either one of these two people would be offended by this particular exchange, but it is something to think about when we're actually talking about these different sorts of issues. So, this is kind of the traditional way that Cross defined his cultural competence. Culture 1, through a professional interaction, interacts with culture 2. Now, through that, we have the guise of cultural competence. But unfortunately, when we start to think about cultural competence, we can start to see when a couple of things change. So we have an interaction that is defined by what would be culturally competent. But now if we look, that interaction could actually have a few different interpretations depending on what culture you're speaking to. And we'll go over a couple of specifics in just a minute. If we look at this, though, we can see one of these arrows is green, 2 of these arrows are red. So if we go through that green arrow, now we can see that that culture believed that that was the proper interaction. They interpreted it the way that it was meant to be interpreted, and it was deemed a culturally sensitive and competent remark. But for these other two cultures, cultures 2 and 3, if we look at them, this might actually happen. These 2 red arrows might be that the interpretation from these cultures might not have been what was deemed appropriate by the interaction. And as a result, culturally insensitive and offensive remarks could have been interpreted. This is starting to become the problem, and this is why we want to start to look at a more customized approach, more cultural sensitivity, as opposed to doing just a cultural competent kind of approach. So the next slide that we have here is going to be a short video. Might seem like a bit of a ridiculous example, but I'd like you to indulge me just for a minute and kind of see exactly what happens in this video.
Excuse me? Down here? Hi.
O-M goodness. They really did hire a bunny. What? I gotta tell you, you are even cuter than I thought you'd be.
Ooh, you probably didn't know, but a bunny can call another bunny cute, but when other animals do it, it's a little...
I am so sorry. Me, Benjamin Clawhauser. The guy everyone thinks is just a flabby donut-loving cop stereotyping you. Oh.
It's okay.
So, looking at that exchange, is it a little ridiculous to use an animated movie about bunny rabbits and tigers talking to one another? Of course. But I think that we can use our imaginations a little bit. And if we replace some of those words, such as bunny and cute, if we replace those with some other words, and I'll let your imaginations wander here because I don't want to use the specific examples, but we can see how those sorts of things might actually come out in a real world situation. And because of that, we need to be very careful with the way that we talk to people. You might hear someone saying something to another person of their own culture and think that because they say it's appropriate. Unfortunately, that is not the case, as we can see by this silly little example here from Disney's Zootopia. Very good movie, by the way. This is where we want to actually look into cultural sensitivity. All right. This term is often used, but it's rarely completely understood. There's very, very many different definitions of cultural sensitivity, which is why I don't have one written down on here specifically. But what it really does is it requires professionals to understand that cultures are different and that professionals should be aware of and understand these differences. And that is a large difference between just trying to create one set of laws, one set of rules that can work on a cross-cultural basis. So we'd like to look at some cultural differences now. So we have some similarities, of course, in almost every culture, all right, and with some except murder is bad, communication is good. Usually food is of some sort of importance, some sort of cultural rituals that people have are usually based around food. All right. Faith is almost important in every person, in every culture's life. Commitment to something greater than oneself. Again, that kind of goes along with faith. And again, not everybody has. And the golden rule, do unto others as you want to be done to yourself. It's a pretty universal rule. But then we look at some of the cultural differences. Perception of eye contact. And there are some people, some cultures that don't make eye contact nearly as much. Other cultures need it to feel like they're having a valuable exchange. Learning those sorts of differences in the culture can be a really, really, really big difference between having an appropriate exchange between two people and having a very, very inappropriate exchange. Same thing goes with eating practices. If you're going out with a business partner who might be of a different religion than you or be of a different culture than you, and we're going to go over one specific eating practice on the next slide, but some eating practices can be deemed very, very, very offensive, where we might just kind of see them as completely normal. Now we have the faith. As you can see, faith is both in the similarities and in the differences, because as much as people and faith in general is a nice glue that holds all of our societies together, obviously the faiths themselves are very, very, very different. So that's one thing obviously to keep in mind when you're interacting with patients, when you're interacting with other people throughout the world, that just because your faith might be something that you use, obviously it's not necessarily something that everybody knows, understands, or even agrees with. Hand gestures, again, we're going to go over a couple of those in the next slide. Those are also very, very, very important. You need to make sure you watch what you're doing and where you're doing it. So something as simple as standing chopsticks up inside of your food doesn't seem like it's a normal thing to do, but you might end up doing it by accident. It's extremely offensive in the Chinese culture. Chinese people usually, when they are doing traditional Chinese acts such as funerals and stuff like that, they tend to use incense that stands straight up out of either sand or some sort of holder. And standing up your chopsticks inside of your food, mainly rice, it resembles that. And I think that that could be one of the reasons that it's offensive. Something as simple as giving a thumbs up, which to us is a very, very positive thing. If you do that to someone in the Muslim culture, you're essentially wishing them, and I love this quote, which is why I wanted to leave it in here, an unpleasant trip to the proctologist. And this one is a little bit off to the side of those examples, but something else that I wanted to talk about is the difference in interpretation of colors. So in America, or in very many westernized cultures, the color white is usually analogous to weddings. You have the white coats on doctors, and it's usually either celebrations or even some sort of professional life. But in Asian cultures, it's actually much more seen with death and with mourning. So wearing white to a celebration of someone in a Chinese culture might end up being something that you do not want to do. Again, these are very specific examples, but they kind of give an idea of how exactly we should be thinking about interactions between different cultures. So now I want to talk about the cultural base, the bias of healthcare. So a couple of the biases that Mr. Lecca started to outline, he started to talk about, and this specific study was based on psychology. He started to talk about the fact that psychology, many of the learnings, many of the teachings in psychology are based on white middle-class philosophy. Views on Eastern medicine have also been very, very much seen as not as important as Western medicine is. So traditional herbal treatments, my apologies, are classified as dietary supplements as opposed to actual medicine. And that's something that, not only can be offensive, but can actually be derogatory in terms of trying to prescribe medicines to people. If they request something that has to do with a Chinese or an Eastern herbal treatment, and you call it a dietary supplement, that can become quite offensive to not only their beliefs, but to their treatment practices as well. And acupuncture is usually seen as a last resort and suggested due to its exotic and foreign associations, as opposed to actually just letting it be what it is. We have to almost sell it to people as an Eastern treatment to say, well, if nothing else worked, maybe you can do this, as opposed to just making it kind of a complementary aspect. Researchers have also shown this a similar bias in complementary and alternative medicines in research. So we can see over in this graph right here, European journals tend to produce a lot more positive study outcomes than United States journals do. And obviously the opposite is true. More negative journals come out of, more negatively based studies, I should say, come out of US journals than do out of European journals. It's such a significant value, they chose to put it on the top there. Now, there are really good randomization, and most of these other study aspects are proper, they're appropriate, but to see this much of a drastic change means that we are either not doing it correctly, or that we are seeing something very, very different than those in Europe and possibly even the Eastern part of the world. So that's something also that we want to start to look at and see why exactly is that happening. So how can we make sure that these biases don't happen? We talk about research, we talk about medicine in general. We want to see how exactly we can prevent these sort of biases from happening. Now, Lecca actually quoted Procter & Davis from a 1994 article in his book, and he had a couple of really, really, really good outlines. Very simple rules to go by, but it's actually not bad. The practitioner needs to be aware of his or her own beliefs and attitudes about racial and ethnic minorities. So if you know that you might, for whatever reason, be a little bit more biased against racial and ethnic minorities, it might be something that you want to work on, or want to make sure that you do not treat those people, because you could very, very easily offend them if your own beliefs might not align with theirs. Practitioners need to understand the worldview of the patient without judging them. Obviously, very, very, very important. We need to see the worldview of these patients, and we need to take them for face value without judgment or anything such as that. And then the practitioner also needs to be aware of how race, culture, and ethnicity affect personalities and personal choices, as well as life experiences. So these second two kind of relate to one another. We need to be aware about how race and culture affect their worldview, essentially. And if we can start to look at these things through their lens, we can be more culturally sensitive for them, and we can begin to understand and treat them that much better. So that's something else that we would like to try to work on. I myself, this is not from any journal, I myself would like to propose maybe a little bit of a new definition for cultural competency. Using cultural sensitivity and knowledge of cultural differences to ensure a comfortable and uniquely customized experience for every person, regardless of race, creed, gender, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. A little bit updated from that 1989 with a couple of those different things on there, but it is definitely something that we want to look at. And I believe that this new definition tends to encompass a little bit more about the changing culture of the United States and of the world in this particular case. So I do believe that having this new definition for cultural competency might help with people being a little bit more culturally competent. Instead of having to memorize a bunch of different rules for a bunch of different people, if we can just grow to understand everyone, and then, have those rules and everything like that, I think it is going to help. I want to make sure that all of our treatment methods are sufficiently researched in all parts of the world. We can see this slide over here. We have Western medicine and their different causes. We have traditional Chinese medicine and their different causes and diagnosis and treatments and everything like that. I want to make sure that we can allow for better understanding of the benefits and the negatives of every single treatment method. So that's something else that we would like to look at. We'd love to improve communication. If something is confusing to you, if some sort of cultural practice is confusing to you, just ask. If you do it in a nice way, and if you do it in a non-judgmental way, like those 3 rules that we just outlined, you're really going to see that there's going to be a really good response. You'll see that people know that you're trying to understand their culture a little bit better, and they want to help you out as much as possible. If you've offended someone unintentionally, make sure you know why. Obviously, apologize, but make sure you know why make sure it never happens again. And last but not least, if you've been offended, really try to make sure that you speak with the person who offended you so that they know why it happened and they know never to do it again.